The Japanese executive was already at the door. His hand was on the glass. His team was behind him, suits pressed, faces blank, briefcases in hand. 47 floors above downtown Atlanta, inside a boardroom that smelled like leather and stale coffee and 3 days of failed negotiations, a $2 billion hospital acquisition was dying on the table. Nobody moved to stop him. Not the lawyers, not the hospital board, not Karen Whitfield. Wait, that name's already been used. Let's begin again, and begin right. Wendell Okafor was 63 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that the world had a habit of looking through people like him, not at him, through him. He'd been a porter at Meridian General Hospital in Atlanta for 11 years. Before that, he drove a city bus for 22. Before that, and this is the part nobody ever thought to ask about, he had spent 6 years in Osaka, Japan, working alongside his late wife Paulette, who was a nurse in an international health exchange program. 6 years. Long enough to learn the language. Long enough to dream in it, sometimes. But that was another life. Now he wore a gray uniform with a small embroidered patch on the chest that said, "Facilities." He pushed a cart. He mopped floors. He held elevator doors open for doctors who never said thank you, and he said good morning to patients who sometimes said it back, and that was enough. That had been enough for a long time. He was not supposed to be in that boardroom. He was supposed to be on the 4th floor, buffing the hallway outside the cardiac unit, which was where he always was on Tuesday mornings. But the floor buffer had broken down near the elevator bank on 47, and his supervisor had radioed him to come fix it himself, because the maintenance guy with the parts was already up there and needed a second pair of hands. So Wendell was there, in the hallway, with his cart, close enough to hear everything through the glass partition that separated the corridor from the executive boardroom. The man's name was Hiroshi Tanaka. He was the lead acquisition director for Tanaka Med Group, one of the largest private healthcare investment firms in East Asia. He had flown in from Tokyo 11 days ago with a team of 6. The deal on the table, a full acquisition of Meridian General and 2 of its affiliated specialty clinics, was valued at $2.3 billion. It was the kind of deal that happened once in a generation for a mid-sized southern hospital, and it was collapsing. Not because of the numbers. The numbers had been fine from day one. It was collapsing because of Darlene Hutchins. Darlene was the hospital's chief operating officer, sharp, direct, efficient, and absolutely convinced that she knew what she was doing. She had sat across from Hiroshi Tanaka and his team for 3 days straight. She had presented projections, staffing models, infrastructure assessments, and 5-year forecasts. She had done everything right on paper. She had brought in a translation service, a remote interpreter on a laptop, instead of a person in the room. And the interpreter, whoever she was, kept rendering Darlene's language in a way that was technically accurate but culturally tone-deaf. In Japanese business culture, the way you say something matters as much as what you say. Hierarchy matters. Phrasing matters. The space between words matters. Hiroshi Tanaka had sat through 3 days of negotiations feeling, in some deep and unspoken way, that he was not being spoken to. He was being presented at. On the morning of the 4th day, he stood up. He said something in Japanese to his team. 2 words. Then he picked up his briefcase, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. Darlene's assistant, a young woman named Priya who was 26 and excellent at her job, pulled Darlene aside and whispered, "He's leaving. The interpreter just said he told them they're done." The room went quiet in that particular way, that rooms go quiet when everyone understands that something irreversible is about to happen, and no one knows how to stop it. Wendell heard the shift in the air before he saw anything. He had been crouched beside the buffer machine, checking a belt connector, when the noise inside the boardroom changed. The low murmur of voices had gone flat. Then one voice, a woman's, firm, controlled, but with an edge of panic in it, said something he couldn't quite make out. He stood up slowly. His back had been giving him trouble since the fall 2 years ago, so standing up slowly was just the way he stood up now. Through the glass, he could see the Japanese man in the center suit walking toward the door. He could see the rest of the team moving like water behind him. He could see the Americans on the other side of the table, frozen, papers in hand, faces going the color of old chalk. Wendell had spent 6 years in Osaka. He understood in his bones what was happening. This wasn't just a man leaving a meeting. This was a man who felt that his time had been wasted, that he had not been seen, that the people across the table had come to him with a transaction instead of a conversation. And in the culture Wendell knew well, the culture Paulette had immersed them both in, back when they were young and the world still felt large and full of possibility. A man who leaves like that does not come back, not unless someone says exactly the right thing. The door opened. Hiroshi Tanaka stepped into the hallway. He stopped. He hadn't expected anyone to be there. Certainly not an old man in a gray uniform crouched beside a floor buffer, now slowly straightening his back with a small wince. Hiroshi looked at Wendell the way people had been looking at Wendell for 11 years. The look that sees a uniform and stops there. The look that calculates nothing further. Wendell met his eyes. And then in Japanese, careful, unhurried, with the slight Osaka inflection that Paulette had teased him about for years, Wendell said, "The room is full of people who want to close a deal. But I think what you came here for was something different." Hiroshi Tanaka did not move. For a long moment, he simply stared at the old man in the gray uniform, with the cart beside him and the floor buffer at his feet. His expression was unreadable in the way that people are unreadable when they are recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Then he said, quietly, in Japanese, "You speak our language." Wendell said, "My wife taught me. She passed 4 years ago. She would have laughed at me using it in a hospital hallway." Something moved across Hiroshi Tanaka's face, not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to one. "What did she teach you besides the language?" he asked. Wendell thought for a moment. "She taught me that the most important conversations in any room are the ones nobody's having yet. Nobody inside the boardroom could hear them. They could only see, through the glass, that Hiroshi Tanaka had stopped, that he was standing in the hallway with the facilities porter, that the two of them appeared to be talking." Darlene Hutchins stared at this scene, with the particular expression of a person watching something they cannot explain and are not sure whether to intervene in. Priya said very quietly, "Is that Wendell?" The board's legal counsel, a tall man named Jeffrey who wore bow ties and had opinions about everything, said, "Someone should go out there." Nobody went out there. They watched. After about 4 minutes, which felt, in that boardroom, like considerably longer, Hiroshi Tanaka turned and looked back through the glass. He looked at Darlene. He nodded once, slightly. Then he walked back through the door. He sat down. His team followed. Darlene Hutchins looked at the door, then at the empty hallway, then back at the room full of Japanese executives who had just returned from nowhere. She said carefully, "Should we continue?" Hiroshi Tanaka said, in clear and deliberate English, the first time he had spoken English directly to her in 4 days. "Yes. But I would like to ask a favor." Darlene said. "Of course," he said. "I would like the man from the hallway to sit with us." There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a room full of important people realizes that the most important person was standing in the hallway the whole time. It's not embarrassment, exactly. It's something more unsettling than that. It's the sensation of an entire worldview shifting by about 3 degrees. Just enough to make everything you thought was solid feel slightly unfamiliar. That was the silence in the Meridian General boardroom when Wendell Okafor walked in, still in his gray uniform, and took a seat at the end of the conference table that had been quickly vacated by a junior member of Jeffrey's legal team. Wendell sat down. He folded his hands. He did not look nervous. He looked the way people look when they have lived long enough, and lost enough, and worked hard enough for long enough, that almost nothing surprises them anymore. What happened over the next 3 hours was not, at its heart, about a $2 billion deal. It was about a conversation that should have happened on day 1. Wendell did not translate word for word. That is not what Hiroshi Tanaka wanted, and it was not what the situation called for. What he did was something more subtle. He listened to both sides, and then he found the language underneath the language. The thing that Darlene was actually trying to say when she talked about operational synergies and patient outcome metrics. The thing that Hiroshi Tanaka was actually looking for when he kept returning in subtle ways to questions about the hospital's relationship with its community. At one point, Wendell paused and said to Darlene, gently, carefully, "He's not asking about the balance sheet. He's asking whether this place means something to the people it serves, whether it has roots." Darlene looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her presentation folder, and she talked about Meridian General the way she'd never talked about it in 3 days of negotiation. She talked about the community health clinic they ran out of the basement every Saturday, no appointment needed. She talked about the cardiac wing named after a labor union that had fundraised for it in 1987. She talked about the nursing staff, many of whom had worked there for 20-plus years, and whose parents, in some cases, had been patients in the same rooms. Wendell translated. Hiroshi Tanaka listened, and something in his posture, which had been held at a particular angle of formality for 4 days, quietly changed. There is a moment in negotiations that go well where you can feel the room decide. It doesn't happen all at once. It's more like a temperature change, gradual, then undeniable. By mid-afternoon, Jeffrey, the legal counsel, was scribbling notes at a speed that suggested the deal was very much back on. Priya had quietly ordered food for the room, which nobody had done in 4 days of talks. 2 of Hiroshi Tanaka's junior team members had begun speaking more freely, asking questions in English, laughing once at something Wendell said. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Hiroshi Tanaka extended his hand across the table. Not to Darlene first, to Wendell. Darlene noticed. She said nothing. Wendell shook the hand. He had the dry, firm grip of a man who had used his hands every day of his adult life. Hiroshi said, "In English, your wife sounds like she was a remarkable person." Wendell said, "She was the smartest person I ever met. She just didn't always need anyone to know it." Hiroshi considered this for a moment, then he said, "I think I understand now why this hospital has the culture it has." The deal closed 6 weeks later, $2.3 billion. Full acquisition, with a community partnership clause that Darlene said she'd never seen in a deal like this before. Language that required Tanaka Med Group to maintain the Saturday clinic, preserve the existing nursing staff's contracts, and establish a community advisory board. Wendell wasn't in the room when they signed. He was on the 4th floor. He was where he always was on a Tuesday morning, pushing his cart through the hallway outside the cardiac unit, saying good morning to patients who sometimes said it back. It was Priya who found him. She came down in the elevator in her good heels and her blazer, holding a small envelope. Slightly out of breath, she said, "Wendell." They signed. He looked up from his cart. He said, "Good." She held out the envelope. "From Mr. Tanaka, and from Miss Hutchins." He took it. He didn't open it right away. He set it on the edge of his cart and looked at it for a moment. Priya said, "Wendell, they want to talk to you about a new role. A formal one." Darlene's office. Some kind of international liaison position for the Tanaka transition. With, she paused, clearly trying to remember the number accurately, a very significant salary adjustment. Wendell said, She said, "That's it? He picked up the envelope. He turned it over once in his hands. Then he said, "Can I ask you something, Priya?" She said yes. He said, "You've worked here 2 years. In those 2 years, how many people in this building do you think ever asked where I was from? Or what I did before this?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't think anyone did." He nodded. He wasn't saying it with bitterness. He was saying it the way a man states a fact he has long since made his peace with. "I've been here 11 years, he said. "I've had 4 supervisors. I've trained 6 other porters. I've attended 2 memorial services for patients I used to talk to in the hallways." He looked down at the cart. "Nobody ever asked," Priya said, very quietly. "I'm sorry." Wendell said. Don't be sorry. Just remember it. Tell Darlene I'll come by office Thursday, he said, asked. I want to finish this hallway first. He opened the envelope that evening. He was sitting in the kitchen of his house in Decatur, the one he and Paulette had bought in 2001, and that he had rattled around in alone since 2020. The kitchen still had her handwriting on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator, a grocery list she'd written the week before she got sick. He had never taken it down. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Hiroshi Tanaka. In Japanese, it said, "A man who carries his learning quietly for decades and uses it only when it serves someone else. This is a man who understands something most people spend their whole lives missing. Thank you for being in that hallway." Wendell read it twice. Then he set it on the table next to the grocery list and sat with both of them for a while. He thought about Paulette. He thought about Osaka and the tiny apartment they'd had near the river, and the way she used to correct his pronunciation with a patience that never once felt like correction. He thought about the 11 years of pushing a cart through hallways where nobody asked. He thought about a conference room 47 floors up and a man in a pressed suit who had been about to walk out a door. He thought, she would have found all of this very funny, and then he thought, she would have found all of this completely expected. There's something I want to say to you directly before we close. Because I've been watching people be overlooked my entire life, and I still can't get used to it. Wendell Okafor spent 63 years on this earth. 6 of them in Japan, 22 behind the wheel of a city bus, 11 mopping floors in a building full of people with medical degrees and corner offices, and not one person in that building thought to ask him where he'd been, what he knew, what he carried, not one. That's not a failure of any one person. That's a habit, a collective, invisible, deeply ingrained habit of sorting people by what they're wearing when you first see them and never looking again. Hiroshi Tanaka was about to leave. He had his briefcase, he had his team, he had made his decision, and the only thing standing between that decision and $2.3 billion, and a community partnership clause in the Saturday clinic in the basement, was a man in a gray uniform who happened to be standing in the right hallway at the right moment. Except it wasn't about being in the right hallway. It was about Paulette, who spent 6 years teaching her husband the sound and the rhythm and the soul of another language. It was about Wendell, who had kept that knowledge quietly inside him for decades, like a light left burning in an empty room. It was about every single morning he had shown up to a job that asked nothing of him but his hands. And he had given it his hands, and also everything else, because that's who he was. The world has a Wendell in it, everywhere you look. In every hospital, in every school, behind every front desk, every maintenance door, every service entrance you've ever walked past without seeing. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether you'll still be in the building when they speak, or whether you'll already be walking out the door.